Last month, the headlines of many British newspapers described London as the cocaine capital of Europe. After testing sewage and wastewater in 42 of Europe's biggest cities, researchers found that the British capital had higher levels of the drug than anywhere else in Europe, 3 times higher than the French capital, Paris. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Amsterdam tested highest for levels of cannabis, and many Eastern European cities tested highest for methamphetamine. The study by Lisbon's European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Addiction also found that drug users in the UK were twice as likely to overdose from hard drugs as any other country in Europe. However, government statistics state that 1 in 12 people in Britain use illegal drugs, and just 1 in 50 people use Class A narcotics. So who is it using all the so-called hard drugs in Britain? And does this discrepancy prove that Londoners really are consuming more hard drugs than anywhere else in the country? Or is it all simply a matter of money? London is Europe's wealthiest city, so does that mean the drug dealers are making a better living in the capital? My name is Simon Parker, and with me to discuss this issue is Mark Dempster, a Harley Street therapist and the author of the book Nothing to Declare, Confessions of an Unsuccessful Drug Smuggler, Dealer and Addict. Nick Barton, Chief Executive of the charity Action on Addiction, and Chris Snowdon, Director of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Mark, simply, why are Londoners using more cocaine than any other city in Europe?
I think historically, I was speaking to Nick before the interview about this, that in the 80s and the early 90s as well, it was very much contained, cocaine use was very much contained within various pockets of society in London. And I think the demographics have changed significantly, especially since 1996, where we've seen, I think they suggest there's a 500% increase in cocaine use. And also we've got accidents and emergencies now that are reporting double the amount of cocaine overdoses than there was before. So I think there's a number of factors. A reason, I think, is that, there's a very big binge drinking culture within London. I think cocaine use helps you to drink more and to socialise more. And I think a lot of the clients that I see in my Harley Street practice are using it combined with alcohol, because each drug on their own is not as effective and as euphoric as when you do it in combination. I think money is, as you said before, London's the capital, a lot more disposable income in London. And I think it's very normalised within the clubbing and the bars, and within, especially in the younger people in London, I think cocaine use is became very normalised and accepted and promoted really amongst that sort of group of young individuals. And I think that's what some of the issues are.
Nick Barton, you're the Chief Executive of the charity Action on Addiction. How would you react to what Mark Dempster said there?
Well, I think I agree pretty well with all he said. I think one of the key issues is that it went from being rather exclusive, sometimes described as a champagne drug or the designer drug in the 70s and 80s, where it maybe cost about £200 to £300 per gram, now down to an average of about £42. So, like most things, when it costs less, there's going to be more of it. And if you can have the supply, then that's going to, of itself, widen the use.
And Mark, do you think there has always been a connection between affluence and the type of drugs people are using? For example, are people in London, where people are generally wealthier, are they more likely to be using one of these champagne drugs which you described?
Yeah, I think there is, because if you even look at Scotland, for example, or Ireland, where there's not as much, in parts of Scotland where there's not as much disposable income, there tends to be less cocaine use in parts of, in Glasgow and Edinburgh and out, especially in the north of Scotland. So what I think, to reiterate what Nick was saying too, is my experience of this is from the 80s. I remember when I first started to use cocaine myself as an individual, it was only really confined within the sort of criminal fraternities or the creative group of people, or people from a sort of higher social spectrum, really. And what definitely did happen through the price changes in the 90s, and as it became cheaper and cheaper, it became accessible right across every spectrum of society. And it's really noticeable to me now when in Harley Street that I get a lot of white middle class women who you wouldn't think you just wouldn't think they'd be using cocaine, but they're taking cocaine every weekend. And this is another factor too, is because it's normalised really cocaine use, and also because a lot of people are using just at the weekends over maybe a long weekend with alcohol. It's very different to drug use per se from the 80s, where people would be using heroin or crack cocaine or not crack cocaine or freebase cocaine. It's a different profile. It's a different drug using profile. That's really changed a lot, I think, in the last few years.
Chris Snowdon, Director of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Would you agree with what Mark Dempster said, that the profile and the reputation of cocaine users has changed over perhaps a 20-year period?
Well, it's certainly broadened out. And yeah, I think it's changed. There's been a fall in the amount of amphetamines and ecstasy being consumed, particularly amongst young people, and that fall has been pretty strong. In fact, drug use in general is down over the last 15, 20 years. But as you've seen the decline in amphetamines and ecstasy, you've seen this rise in cocaine use, also in methadone use and some of the legal highs. So you can explain the consumption of drugs using the usual economic explanations of affordability and availability, and I think they're both perfectly germane here. But then you have the rather woollier concepts of culture and fashion. I mean, let's not forget about the relevance of fashion here. Within youth subcultures, you traditionally have different drugs associated with different eras, different styles of music even. So amphetamines would be associated with punk, came back with the rave culture. Obviously ecstasy is associated with rave culture. And you've really only seen cocaine be a significant part of youth culture in the 21st century because it was too expensive before then.
You deal with people who are dealing with addictions, and I think Chris has brought up a very interesting point here. Are cocaine users the yuppie stockbroker types of yesteryear, or are they just normal people in village pubs?
Well, there's a kind of implication in the question about, and Mark referred to it, the middle class. Isn't it surprising that they use this stuff? That somehow the middle class, because you're middle class, you should have some kind of immunity or resistance, natural inbuilt resistance to using powerful mood-altering drugs. But that ignores the fact that actually, you're a human being. Underneath that, you may have all sorts of reasons for wanting to change the way you feel, which is ultimately what drug use and addiction is the far end of drug use is all about. So it's just that your experience of life may be somewhat different, and you may have the advantages which other people don't have, but it doesn't mean that you're not going to be drawn to excitement, thrill-seeking, stimulation to get out of it. In other words, you're not really at ease with the way that you feel. You're not content with that, so you're going to do something about it. And people do drugs because drugs work.
Mark Dempster, What is it about cocaine which makes cocaine unique? It's often glorified, isn't it? I mean, for example, recent films, The Wolf of Wall Street, Johnny Depp in Blow, Daniel Craig in Layer Cake. It's almost seen as an aspirational thing, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, cocaine's it's a funny drug from the perspective of, I've used every drug. I've not used ketamine and stuff like that because they weren't around. Well, they were around, but I never got access to them way back. But cocaine gives you such a euphoric feeling, and I guess, and especially if you smoke it, if you inject it, what we're talking about really here within this setting is really people who are sniffing cocaine at the weekends or going out and drinking and binge drinking and such like. But the other end of that is when you start to inject it, and the feeling that you get when you inject it, it's such a strong. The only way I could describe the feeling of that is comparing it maybe with an orgasm, and it's in that type of same area. Of course, what happens is you're getting a massive amount of dopamine being released in the brain, and of course it's the law of diminishing returns. You try and get the same, you have a pipe again, or you have some more lines, or you inject it again, and you're looking for that same hit. But of course the hit, you can't get the same amount of dopamine released in the brain, so you keep chasing it, and then eventually you wind up you're sniffing it for days, or you're smoking it for days, and eventually you hit a place where you're desperate. And to emphasise, I guess, what Nick was saying too, is the core of the issue is not so much about the substance, it's about changing the way you feel, that needing something to medicate a deeper sense of unrest. This is what I see with addiction all the time, is that actually what the person's doing is they're It could be cocaine, it could be ketamine, it could be sex, it could be gambling, it could be any sort of form of addictive behaviour. But the person ultimately is trying to find some ease and comfort through the use of that drug.
Nick, would you agree that there is always an underlying issue? Can people not merely use drugs recreationally and socially and still manage to manage a mild addiction almost?
Well, they can, and they can appear to, but one has to ask the fundamental question: why are they not content with the way they are, and why are there not non-chemical ways, which there are, of enjoying yourself or getting up or relaxing and so on? Why does it have to be chemical? Because somehow it's not enough. The self-regulation is not enough. It doesn't seem to work in many people, so they have to turn to something else, artificial or external, in order to boost those things.
Chris Snowdon, how do you react to that?
Well, I would draw the parallel with alcohol. I mean, most people drink alcohol. A relatively small number of people drink alcohol out of desperation, become addicted to it, and drinking incredibly large quantities of it. But that doesn't mean that everybody who drinks alcohol is somehow unhappy or seeking some sort of way out. So I think you do have to draw a distinction between people who are injecting cocaine, taking, spending hundreds of pounds a week on it, and people who take it now and again, recreational, in pubs and nightclubs, never have any problems with addiction as a result of it. And I don't know what the proportion of the people who are taking cocaine in London fall into each of those categories, but there's surely a non-trivial number who are using it perfectly recreationally, not because they're particularly upset or sad or depressed, probably quite the reverse, probably just as something to supplement the drinking, to keep them out partying for longer, and they'll take it a few times and then never take it again once they get to a certain age.
I think you're right there, Chris. There is a group, of course there is, and there's only maybe 10% or whatever, a small percentage that are using it addictively, like there is a percentage the same who drink alcohol and become alcoholic. But I guess it's for those particular people that have that addictive nature and that are looking for some sort of, they're trying to medicate that deeper sense of unrest. Those are the ones that need treatment, really. They're the ones that, for the recreational users, they'll carry on and they'll maybe change their drug use over time, or they'll grow out of it, which is what happens, really. They sort of grow out of it. And there's no problem with that group of people as far as, they're not harming anyone else, they're just doing their thing. But for the group that have got the addictive personality, have got a problem, they need to be channeled into the appropriate treatment, because these are the drug-related deaths. These are the ones that commit a lot of crime. I mean, we know that, 95% of crime is committed by 5% of the population. It usually is, drug users. I mean, drug users who are dependent are committing most of the crime. It's my experience of this working in the criminal justice system years.
Are you talking now with your therapist hat on, or how do you think you would have reacted if you were in here 20 or 25 years ago? Yeah. What do you think you would have said about this issue? Would you think you would have had an underlying issue, or were you just a young man trying to have as much fun as possible and living your life?
No, it's difficult, Simon, because I had so much denial. So 18 years ago, if you'd asked me the same question, I'd have been saying, oh no, I'm just having a good time. I just like to party. I just like to have fun, even though the consequences are horrendous. I had so much denial. But then, luckily, I went to a residential place and they said, well, this is an illness, this is a progressive illness, and you suffer from this, and they challenged a lot of my conceptions around drug use. So it's changed significantly, believe me.
Nick, what is it specifically about cocaine which it can go under the radar in society?
Well, I suppose it can be considered a high functioning drug, a bit like nicotine to some extent, or caffeine, is that some people can take it, stimulate themselves and produce and all the rest of it, so that it's not necessarily just recreational. For some people, particularly in high pressure environments, I suspect like parts of London. So it's like an adjunct to super functioning for some people. But a lot of these things, they find you out. The behaviour of whatever reason you're doing it for, you might be doing it for recreation, you might be doing it, as I say, for better performance of some kind or another. Some of those people, they will have a vulnerability they don't know is there until they do it.
Chris Snowdon, I was reading a very interesting article of yours this morning, which was almost putting the positive effects of a non-prohibition nation in terms of drugs. How could and would the British relationship with cocaine be if prohibition didn't exist?
Well, it's very difficult to say. I mean, the obvious thing would be to compare our situation now with before they were made illegal, but there are obvious problems with that insofar as people are much wealthier now. You had the whole rock and roll scene and the normalisation of drugs, which of course ironically has happened under Prohibition. I think the first thing to do would be to accept that the way we consume drugs would be different. There's no reason to assume that if we legalised cocaine that people would be buying it in grams and snorting it and injecting it. There's no reason why they wouldn't be put into other products. So things would change enormously. I don't know what would happen in terms of prevalence. There are some people who say that the drugs market is already saturated and there wouldn't be any change in the number of people who consume it. And as evidence, they use the example of places like Portugal and the Netherlands, where you've had a much more relaxed regulatory regime, and there hasn't been a big spike in drug consumption. I'm more sceptical about that. Apart from anything else, legalisation would mean lower prices. And in fact, that would be one of the main benefits of legalisation, is you wouldn't have such high prices as to lead to acquisitive crime. So if you have lower prices, I think generally you would assume that there's going to be some increase in consumption.
Mark Dempster, you spent many years dealing, using, smuggling drugs around the world before becoming a drugs addiction specialist. How would taking the drug trade away from organised criminals and to the state as an organisational tool change the trade and distribution of drugs in Britain but also around the world? The
people who are drug dealing or drugs, smuggling drugs from country to country, if there's no market, you wouldn't be doing it anymore. So what would happen to those individuals is they'd find something else to make their money, to generate income from. It's a bit like the mafia came here in the 60s to sell heroin in Britain and London, and they could see there was no market really for heroin to be sold here. And so they never came back really. So it was only years later through various drug laws and the Roller Stone Committee and various other things that happened that a market was set up, a black market was set up. So I think my only thing about legalisation, I like the Portuguese model of decriminalisation. I can see that it's got benefits around, especially if you channel the people. If they get arrested, you then channel them into treatment and get them help and support. My fear is with legalisation is you would just have so many business entrepreneurs that the media would just be, if you look at our TV this now, it's swamped with, you look at gambling addiction, like gambling addictions now and gambling, the gambling industries. We're continually getting media around gambling or alcohol or cigarettes. Or if it was legalised, this would be the same. And I think this would have such an effect on the younger generation that it would become very normalised to use. And we know that, especially with alcohol and cigarettes, it's the biggest killers. So I don't know how it'd benefit.
But couldn't a legalisation and the extra tax revenue could be flowed into treatment and helping people with these addictions in a better manner? What would you suggest, Nick?
We need to take Chris's point that if it becomes cheaper, it's more likely that it will be consumed more, because that is the tendency. If it costs less, people will do it more. Take alcohol. That's why we have a minimum pricing campaign. But there's the key points about alcohol and tobacco. They are both legal drugs, and yet they are our biggest problems. Smoking causes more deaths. Alcohol, we have a massive problem with alcohol and its effect on, cancer and obesity and all the other things, and they're perfectly legal. It may be that there'll be some benefits, but let's think that it's going to be a panacea to remove all legal constraint, because it won't be.
Chris, how do you react to what Nick's just said there?
Yeah, I don't think it will be a panacea at all. I think so long as you have any substances of this sort, you're bound to have problems with them. And it's true of tobacco, true of alcohol, true even of gambling. But the question is, seeing we can't get rid of them, what do we do about it? And for me, I think if we're going to talk about the gambling analogy, let's look at the comparison between places which banned gambling and places which legalised it. That's the relevant comparison. If you look at somewhere like China, which has gambling, gambling is illegal in nearly every form apart from a state lottery, you have one of the highest prevalences, if not the highest prevalence, of gambling addiction in the world, and you have an enormous amount of gambling goes on, all on the black market, all untaxed, all unregulated. So that's the relevant comparison. Similarly, alcohol, you need to look at what happened in America under Prohibition. That's the relevant comparison. So if you have legalisation, you can have some form of regulation. Of course, you're still going to have problems with it. Of course, you may well see prevalence go up, although again, that will depend on cultural changes and how people feel about taking drugs when they are legal. Will people actually just think they're rather silly and get bored of them? We don't know. But My main concern is getting rid of this enormous black market, which is killing tens of thousands of people, could be paying billions of pounds of tax, and is allowing drugs to go on the market which are adulterated.
Nick Barton from the charity Action on Addiction.
You mentioned about funding of treatment, and it's interesting that in the case of gambling, there is a levy on the gambling which goes in towards treatment. That's not the case with alcohol. Yeah. It's not the case with tobacco. That is an interesting question. One professor described it as why not have polluter pays. And it's something that I think we ought to consider, particularly as it becomes difficult. It is a massive source of health problems across this country.
But the government could do that any time it wanted to. It gets about £20 billion from tobacco and alcohol money, and none of that is ring-fenced for healthcare or anything else.
Nick had previously said that he thought that many people could get their thrills in life from non-substance means. But personally, I would disagree with that. And I think, Mark, I'd be interested to find out what you believe in this. Is there not something innate within most human beings in which they would like to use substances to feel not normal? Is there any truth in that? Surely we've been using drugs and substances for thousands of years to try and escape from this normality and this reality. If we had prohibition or legalization, people would still go down those pathways, wouldn't they? We've
seen from ancient Egypt and way back thousands of years that people have used various different drugs, and even from the laughing gases parties here, and there's always been a need really within any sort of society to medicate, to use drugs or alcohol to change the way they feel. And yeah, is it an intrinsic need? Is it sort of, part of the human condition to chase that? If you think of little children when they're spinning round trying to get dizzy, trying to get some sort of hit, it does seem like it is part of the human condition. Most people can use drugs or alcohol to change the way they feel when they don't develop an issue with it. They don't develop a problem with it. They use it. They've got an on-off switch. But for that sort of small percentage, that 10 or 15%, those are the main groups that do develop a problem, and they have really significant issues with it. And they are, as I said before, drug-related deaths and such like. And as long as we can make sure that we provide the necessary treatment, we give them easy access to treatment. And it was interesting what Chris said about, that money could be channeled, the money, like if it was legalised, it could be channeled into treatment. I'd like to see if that, but often I don't think this happens. I think the money gets pushed into something else, and it doesn't get allocated to a certain group of people.
Chris Snowdon, you're the Director of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. What you really championing here is freedom of choice. Is that what you'd like to see? And just in this case, it happens to be drugs and narcotics, which is the subject.
Yeah, the Institute of Economic Affairs was founded to promote free markets and individual liberty. And so drugs is a great example of where the market is limited heavily by the government, and you see all these terrible unintended consequences. You see them to a somewhat lesser extent with tobacco and alcohol as well, where the market is deliberately overregulated by government. And things like minimum pricing, which have been mentioned, and high taxes, these are anti-market approaches which do bear cost. They may bear benefits as well, but they do bear cost because they put the price up of the product, and they are regressive in their nature. So as with most issues, we think at the Institute of Economic Affairs the free market approach to drugs would be the best. We think that is empirically the case, and we think that 100 years of prohibition have more than demonstrated the failure of trying to stamp something out which cannot be eradicated.
And you're saying that criminals shouldn't be part of that free market?
Absolutely. Because you get all the problems you have when you can't enforce contract law, where everything has to be settled by violence. And that is why whichever part of the world has been the centre of drug production is also the murder capital of the world, whether it's Mexico now or Colombia or Turkey, or wherever it may be. This is not going to be stamped out. The war on drugs cannot be won. I don't think that legalisation is a panacea. I just see it as a lesser of two evils.
I'm saying that I'm not saying people shouldn't do it because as you say, for millennia, that's what human beings have done, and occasionally interesting tribes do all sorts of interesting things with interesting chemicals. What I'm saying is it's become such a consuming relationship and to such intensity. Let's sometimes step back and think, is there another way? Could we actually Does it always have to be this? Because we also, don't forget, get bombarded with lots of advertising and messages about, you can change the way you feel by taking this drug or that drug or the other drug. And there is a big issue with prescription medication and also with over-the-counter medication, not necessarily always a drug.
So that goes back to what Mark said, in which at the moment it is perpetuated through word of mouth and through generation. But if it went into the hands of PR firms and agents, it could do even more harm than good.
I mean, you would have independent companies set up, wouldn't you, just be promoting their product, and of course they would all be competing against each other, and I'm sure you'd be getting bombarded on the television and radio of all these new products, and that would have such an influence in society. But I think it's interesting also what Chris was saying about my experience also of this is, and I remember many years ago in the 80s when I wound up in prison in Alarin prison in Malaga for smuggling drugs and hash into England at the time. But what had happened just before that, most of the people who were involved in serious crime here in England, bank robberies and such like, had converted. They started to sell drugs because they could see there was just as much money to be made from selling drugs as there was in doing bank robberies, and they would get far less time in prison. And most of the people that I was in prison with were English, and in this particular prison were a lot of English and Scottish and Irish who were smuggling drugs, and they're all working for sort of organised villains from England. I can see that link with Spain too. If you look at Spain and the amount of cocaine that comes through Spain, and you look at Britain, most of the cocaine that's flowing through and coming out of South America is hitting Spain, that's getting transferred here to England. And it's a massive business. It's such a massive business, and I can see the links continually with sort of organised crime, old organised crime families and drug trade and the supply of especially cocaine into England.
Just finally, we're running out of time now, but I'd just like to give you 30 seconds each or so, just to give me an idea of how you perceive things developing in the future, perhaps in the next 20 years, the sale and distribution of drugs, which we've covered. But what do you think will happen? I know everyone has their opinions, but what do you actually think will happen within the next 20 years?
I think it's quite likely we'll see either the decriminalisation or the legalisation of cannabis. I don't think we'll see any liberalisation with other drugs. The reason I say that is you've got parts of America which are legalising cannabis, and this is an enormous breakthrough. You've also got countries like Uruguay and Bolivia that are looking to get out of the UN Convention on Drug Control. And I think that the experiment in America in particular, which of course is the country that started the war on drugs, I think it will be a success. And I think there won't be very much pressure to pull back on that. And therefore I think it will spread to other countries.
Chris Snowdon, thank you. Mark Dempster, your opinion?
Yeah, I actually think Chris is quite right. I think cannabis is likely to get decriminalised. I do think that maybe other drugs will be decriminalised and they'll maybe follow a Portuguese model, but I'm not really sure if any government would take that on at this point. I think it's, it isn't an election winner, no. I think, so what I also know about is that treatment for people with substance misuse problems is the money, the allocated funds for that is going to be much more difficult in years to come to get, especially residential treatment. And I think as funds get short, the budgets get consumed with obesity and other issues within healthcare. So, but I think more money should be put into drug treatment. I think the opposite is the case.
Nick Barton?
I think there's a sort of inevitable loosening of controls which will continue. Whether that's a good thing or not, I think remains to be seen. What I do think is that I echo the last sentiment, which is that we do need proper investment in treatment. What we lack, particularly also in this country, is a lack of research. The budgets for research in this country into a major issue is pathetic compared with the billions that go into this, to research in the United States, for example.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, but I'd like to thank my guests who were part of the discussion. They were Mark Dempster, a former drug user and dealer who now works as an addictions counsellor in London, Nick Barton, Chief Executive of the charity Action on Addiction, and Chris Snowdon, Director of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs.